Welcome back to my channel. Every day we use these prominent websites which are built with either Python, JavaScript or PHP. In this video we will have a hands-on approach into these three popular languages side by side. They all have distinct syntaxes and follow different paradigms but share fundamental concepts that make up their code anatomy. Let's start with Python, which is clean, readable and simple. Before we get into variables, let's first talk about different data types, which could be numerical, or text, a string of characters, or even a logical boolean. This is true across all three languages, as I'll demonstrate shortly. Also, all languages use comments, which are lines of code that are skipped during execution. I encourage you to leverage your code editor or IDE with their shortcuts when commenting code. Comments could be in a single line or in multiple lines. We'll get to see a lot of these as we go. Now, back to our data. We need to store this data in a container, a bucket, pretty much a space in memory. We use variables to store data. Python and JavaScript are dynamically typed, so this is inferred based on the value that is stored. We need to use descriptive names, mnemonic names. We also have to start naming variable with a character, a letter, or an underscore. Please avoid using reserved words as we'll run into conflicts. Python also recommends that we use snake case when writing the names of variables. Now, a statement is a line of code. One or more statements together make up a block of code. In Python, we do not need semicolons or curly braces to separate lines of code and blocks of code. We use white spaces and indentations for this purpose. Now, let's jump into JavaScript. As you can see, JavaScript also has comments, single line and multi-line comments. When it comes to variables, our data is stored, and also JavaScript uses dynamic typing. To be able to define variables in JavaScript, we use the var, let, or const keyword. Const keyword is used for variables or values that do not change much. Let keyword is preferred to var keyword because of the scope, hoisting, and redefinition purposes. When it comes to comments, you can also have comments within the line at the end, or end line comments if you call them those. Now, on to PHP. PHP and JavaScript usually use semicolons at the end of their statements. Remember, a statement is a line of code, but semicolons are not mandatory, or rather they are mandatory with PHP. PHP also has commenting. Like I said, leverage your IDE or code editor to add those comments because there are some subtle differences here and there. PHP, for instance, has many ways you can comment code and so on. Now, for variables with PHP, remember PHP, JavaScript, and Python all use these basic data types which we discussed earlier. But for the variables, every variable in PHP starts with a $sign. The reason is because it's inherited from Perl, and it's very useful in parsing the data when it's embedded within HTML, and also when you're doing string concatenations. Naming convention again, PHP and JavaScript favor camel case, which is different from snake case. And we always want to follow those naming conventions, starting with letters, underscores, or avoiding the use of keywords and reserved words. Note that case sensitivity is very important. For instance, the way false is written in PHP, JavaScript, and Python. Now, that's it for basic data types. Each one of these programming languages also have advanced data types. Python, for instance, uses list, which are collections of data. They could be of the same data type or different data types, which we will look at later on. Python also uses key value pairs, which are stored in curly braces, and the key has to be unique. We cannot have the same key within the same data structure. Instead of using an equality sign to assign the key or the value to the key, we use a colon, and you can have as many keys as you want. The values, you can have values that are not unique. For instance, our likes and comments are low, but they are distinct. We could have the same value that should be okay. So this type of data structure in Python is known as a dictionary. So again, dictionaries have unique keys and multiple values. You can also nest these together to have advanced data structures. With JavaScript, we have arrays instead of lists. Python also has arrays, but that's for another day. Now, the array definition is very similar to the definition of a list. But arrays, you have to have the same data type within your array. You cannot mix the data types for arrays. And for advanced data types, again, from similarity with dictionaries, we have objects for JavaScript. This is actually what is known as JavaScript object notation, or JSON. So again, we're using this key value pair idea, and unique keys, values could be the same. Now, for PHP, very the same with JavaScript when it comes to arrays, but you want to make sure you use the right keyword to define your variables, or rather, in this case, your list, or should I say your arrays and your dictionaries. Now, for dictionary equivalent for PHP, we have associated arrays, which are written a little differently. Instead of curly braces, we use square brackets, and instead of the columns, we use the equal to and greater than sign to point the key to a value. And that covers it for data types. Next up, we talk about control flow, focusing on conditionals to begin with. So let's close the previous files, and just to make sure things are a little bit clean, we're going to create a few more files in here, conditionals, and make sure that for each of these files, Python files will always have a .py extension, JavaScript will always have a .js extension, and PHP will always have a .php extension. Now, before we jump into conditionals, it's always useful to be able to handle input. We've had some output already with the hello world being printed on the screen. So we'll need to be able to understand the importance of operators as well as expressions along the way. So to get an input for Python, we use the input built-in function. So that input takes in a prompt, what is actually going to be displayed on the screen before the input is accepted. So we assign that input to a particular variable. In this case, on line 7, we call it age. And that can also be casted because every input that is received in Python is a string. That is true for JavaScript as well. So for JavaScript, we're going to assign the age to be received as a string, but we're using a prompt built-in function instead of input. Once we've accepted that input, we can now parse it using parseInt to convert it from a string to an integer, similar to how we are casting the int in the Python code. All of this can be done in a single line of code. It's up to you, your preference. Down in the comments, you can let me know which you prefer. If you would like to nest this function or do it in 2 lines of code. Now, Let's jump onto PHP. Remember, for PHP, we always need our PHP tags. These tags are interpreted by the PHP interpreter on the server. The code is run on the server before it's sent alongside with the results, everything else to the front end. Now, for PHP, we use a different type of built-in function called readline. They all do the same thing, they just have different names. Also, remember your semicolon at the end of the statement. Just like JavaScript and Python, we get to cast the input, which is going to be a string. So we use the int function in parentheses to do that with PHP. And that covers it for making sure that we have inputs. But always ensure that you clean up your inputs and you also validate it. So sanitize and validate it for errors. Now on to conditional execution. Python, again, straightforward. You have a simple if statement, which you use with indentations. Remember, blocks of code are indented and we use our white spaces as well. And we check for a condition using the operator. If the age is greater than 18, just print out that you are an adult. It's very similar for JavaScript, but JavaScript uses curly braces instead of indentations for a block of code. Here we can just output the same thing using console.log for our output. PHP, along the same lines with JavaScript, uses curly braces. Again, curly braces are going to hold the blocks of code. It could be one line, it could be multiple lines, it's up to you. For our output, we use the echo, keyword to be able to output that you're an adult. That is just a simple condition. In some cases, you might need an alternative, either or. If you need an alternative for Python, it's easy. You just slap an else statement in there. Make sure you pay attention to your indentation. Otherwise, you might have some error messages for syntax. The same with JavaScript, you add a else block and make sure that you use curly parentheses as well. And from that, you can simply output what you want as the alternative. PHP, pretty much the same thing. Output something else for the alternative and you're good to go. That simply covers it for JavaScript, PHP, and Python in terms of having these simple conditionals. But conditions could get a little bit complicated when we start looking at chained conditions or nested conditions. Think about grades, A grade, B grade, C grade, and so on. Now, you also have to remember that we have many different operators, as we don't necessarily have to check greater than, we can check less than, and so on. Those are all comparison operators. We have arithmetic operators as well as logical and assignment operators. Down in the comments, I'll encourage you, let me know if you know the differences between how and or combination operators are used in Python, JavaScript, and PHP. Or if you'd like me to share more information, reach out, subscribe to my channel. More videos are coming up. Others are already out there. Make sure you watch them, and I enjoy your comments as well. Now, for PHP and for JavaScript, you might also have other ways in which you handle conditions. Okay. In this case, I'm talking about switch statements. A switch statement is more elegant, but it is not the case, or it is not used in Python. Now let's expand this a little bit and take a quick look at switch statements in PHP. So before you start with your switch statement, again, we're going to get a user's input and then convert that input to an integer, which will take care of that later on. For a switch statement, I think I need to make sure that I use my semicolon at the end. Yep. Now, for a switch statement, you get a parameter that's passed to the switch statement, and then you have several cases. If that parameter evaluates to a particular case or a value that's passed for the case, then that output is given and we break out of that loop. Now, the parameter could be a condition, an expression, or whatever expression you have. And just like that, you can have as many different cases as you wish. At the end of the day, you want to have a final case to be able to capture anything that doesn't fall within the options that you have. You know, in some cases, if else statements, you use the keyword finally in some programming languages. But in the case of switch statements, you use the default keyword to be able to output what needs to be outputted or evaluated if the rest do not work. So like I said, switch statements also work for JavaScript. So pretty much the same syntax. You just have to remember that the way you define your variables and also your semicolons at the end, including also casting the value that is inputted from a string to an integer. Make sure that our values are always going to be correct within our switch statement. Or we can just use strings in the cases if we prefer to not have to cast it. But it's up to you. Your approach is what makes it optimal for the case in point that we're trying to achieve for our business logic. So once again, you might want to leverage the use of your IDE or code editor to be able to make major changes together, shortcuts, copying lines, searching and replacing values, and so on and so forth. Now, for PHP, or rather for Python, we don't use a switch statement. Instead, we use an elif, which is short for else if statement. So once again, we go ahead and grab input, convert it into an integer. The simple if statement, this time around, we're using two equal signs, which is a comparison operator and not an assignment operator. So we compare the entry date. If it's 1, we go ahead and print out Monday. We do the same if it's 2, print out Tuesday, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, instead of using the default, we use the else to capture anything else that is not 1 to 7. And that answers our question for while, or should I say switches. Now, let's take a look at loops and iterations. One more time, we're going to create new files to be able to handle those for Python, JavaScript, and PHP with the right extensions. And just to know that, the more complex and dynamic your programs get, you get to use these control structures. You need to repeat a bunch of tasks or a single task and so on. So Python, JavaScript, and PHP, they all handle it pretty much the same way. The syntax might be different, but the basic concepts are the same. For instance, you have for loops that are definitive. We know the number of times it needs to be iterated, and maybe on top of structures. We also have while loops when we have unknown number of times we need to perform a certain task. So we need to always remember, avoid having infinite loops. Make sure that the condition you're testing at some point in time needs to become false. All right. So simply put, you first start by setting up a counter, creating a variable that needs to be checked. That's one of the good reasons we need variables. So a for loop is very simple for Python. You just use a for and you check the value compared within a range. In this case, the range 5 gives us values from 0 to 4. And we are able to print that value in our output. So again, for Python, it's simple. We can use an F string to output or to concatenate strings. We can also use concatenation, interpolation, and other ways. And it's as simple as that. So again, setting up your counter ahead of time is very important. For while loops, again, I'm not sure how many times it's going to run. So we go ahead and set up a new counter. The while loop is just going to run until our particular condition is met. In this case, we're going to print that new counter, which is 10, and then we decrement it by reducing 1 from the actual value during that iteration. So for decrements, we use minus equal to 1 decrement operator. But for other programming languages like JavaScript and PHP, which we are looking at, we can use a different approach or different syntax. So let's go ahead and create a counter in JavaScript and use the same for loop per se. And in this case, though, our counter is actually created within a for loop, I should say. And we have 3 things that are happening within the parentheses. We first of all initiate the counter to start at a particular value, and then we go ahead and specify what value it should stop at when the condition should be met. The condition in this case is in the middle, and we have our step at the end. The step could be an increment or decrement depending on what we are trying to achieve. So in here, we're going to start from 0. We're going to end when it's equal to 5, and we're going to increment from 0 to 5. And on the 5th line, we use the plus increment operator, which is not available in Python, possibly because of readability issues. Now, for a while loop, you need to, ahead of time, define the counter, define that variable. So we go ahead and say, hey, let our new counter be 10. We start our while loop by checking if that value is less than or equal to 0. And from there, we can go ahead and check that everything works just fine. All right. So PHP, like I said, very similar to JavaScript. We're going to pretty much just copy everything over and make sure that instead of using let for defining our variable, we use our $, and I'll just go ahead and do a quick search and replace, and we should be good. So again, make sure you have your PHP tags. If you're going to write a comment outside the PHP tag, understand that that comment is going to be a comment similar to what you have in HTML. So HTML has a different way of commenting out its code, but when you're within the PHP tag, the comment can use either / or hashtag. So we have a do while loop, which pretty much just runs once before the condition is checked. That do while loop is present in JavaScript as well as PHP, but we don't have any need for a do while loop in Python. Next up, let's talk about modularity, which is very important for all 3 programming languages. We'll create some files, functions with the right extension, and understand that this helps with the code reuse, also for organization of our code, and to make it very easy to work with. Now, let's start with Python. We first start by defining a function before we can use it. So for function definitions in Python, we use the keyword def. Provide a function with a name, and if the function is using parameters, we pass them within parentheses. We go ahead and use 1 or more lines of code or statements to actually get the function's body of what needs to be done. It's very similar as well for PHP and JavaScript. JavaScript, again, as well as PHP, use the function keyword instead of the def keyword. And the body of the function is wrapped around curly braces, while for Python, we use our normal indentations. All right. So we just have to remember for JavaScript, we want to make sure that we're using the right variable names, and for PHP we also want to use the right variable names. So variable names in PHP always start with a $sign, but we don't need $signs for the function. And we also need echo for output for PHP. Meanwhile, we use console.log for output in JavaScript. So that's pretty much it. Now for calling the function, it is pretty much identical across the board. You provide the name of the function. The function has arguments that are entered when, or that are created at definition, and then we can pass in parameters when we're calling the function. So John Doe in this case would be name for all three functions, and that should be it. And functions could be more complicated than that. In our previous videos, I encourage you to subscribe and also watch these videos. It's totally very in-depth on both built-in and creating our own user-defined functions. They could be fruitful or void. I could use one or more parameters. We even have a couple of games from rock, paper, scissors, as well as dice games that we use functions in examples in our Python video. So watch that video. Like I said, subscribe to my channel. There is a lot more that you can gain from it, and also make sure you share it. Thank you. Now, finally, object-oriented programming, or OOP. We've seen this before actually in our previous video on programming paradigms. I encourage you to check out that video as well. Again, we're changing our perspective of how to think altogether. We're thinking in these terms in object-oriented fashion, where everything is an object, which is built from a blueprint, which is a class. So we have a class that acts as a blueprint. We build objects, which are instances of the class. And the key paradigms or the key concepts to understand with OOP are inheritance from a superclass, polymorphism, different ways in which you can have attributes shown, encapsulation, and abstraction. So I'll go ahead and cover OOP detailedly for all three of these languages, because I think we're going over time here. And so far we've already covered everything. This is part 4, I think, of a video series. We looked at which programming language you should choose. We also set up the environment very quickly, tested it out that it's good. We created simple apps with JavaScript, PHP, as well as Python, as we've been doing so far multiple times. And we've looked at the coding anatomy. So I would cap this off with an object-oriented programming video that goes in depth looking at all of these major concepts. Thank you for watching this video, and I encourage you to stick around for more fun, engaging content. It's been Vitusdk. You already know.